To be small does not necessarily mean to be insignificant or incapable. Israel stands as proof of that thesis. Since its inception, the country has produced a batch of impressive weapons ranging from drones, tanks, missiles, to satellites and cybersecurity. Yes, Israel has done well for itself in terms of creating an indigenous aerospace and defense industry. But how did this come to be? How did a small nation of 8 million become a high-tech military superpower? I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Today's episode is made possible by NordVPN, which is a tool that hides your IP and reduces your digital footprint. The app is perfect for those working from home, but it works on mobile devices just as well. NordVPN is affordable and user-friendly. Just go to nordvpn.com/CaspianReport and use the promo code CaspianReport to get a discount on the premium version. The fact that Israel is a major player in the global arms market is hardly news. Those who disapprove of the country find it a source of resentment, while those who approve of Israel find it a source of empowerment. But whatever the geopolitical preferences are, to understand the Israeli arms industry is to understand the state of Israel. When the country came into existence, its military existed of a band of ragtag militias who barely had the means to manufacture ammunition for their firearms. The government had to import weapons from established defense industries, which was oftentimes done covertly and illegally. That arrangement worked well enough in the early years of state building, but in the 1970s, things took a U-turn. Israel had made a severe geopolitical miscalculation. You see, up until then, France had been the primary weapon supplier of Israel, but for political considerations, the French decided otherwise and cut Israel off. No more fancy warplanes and tanks. At the same time, the Soviets began pouring massive quantities of sophisticated weapons into the Arab states. Soon after, a devastating war broke out. Israel still came out the victor, but the next round of hostilities was already brewing. Plus, the conflict revealed a strategic vulnerability on the part of the Israelis, their reliance on foreign military suppliers. If Israel was to survive the next few decades, it had to do something differently. And since it could never match the Arabs in terms of manpower, weaponry, and finances, Israel could either innovate or disappear. That imminent danger of total annihilation was a crucial source of inspiration. It sharpened the mind, and Israel embarked on a nationwide program to foster new defense industries. Israeli lawmakers tapped into the Jewish tradition for scholarship and transferred those human resources into research and development. A substantial portion of the GDP was devoted to this, more so than any other country. At the same time, a new military unit, known as the Talpiot Project, was created where recruits were tasked to observe and innovate. Members of the Talpiot had previously demonstrated outstanding academic ability in science and leadership potential. They were selected and embedded in each branch of the Israeli military, from infantry, artillery, engineering to intelligence and aerospace. The Talpiot recruits learned the ins and outs of the military and then joined the research and development program. Similar training programs were later created to attract new talents into the ranks of the military. For instance, a special program was set up that encouraged the employment of veterans into high-tech and engineering companies. So if you were part of a tank crew and you had experience in armored warfare, you would be encouraged to join the development of combat vehicles. While these reforms were being implemented, Israel did something else that was quite unusual. It demolished the bureaucracy, splitting military officials from scientists and entrepreneurs. As a result, the military was able to swiftly and easily communicate its needs to lawmakers, investors, and academics. This close association was then applied within the military hierarchy itself. For example, while most militaries frown upon argumentation between ranking officers, in Israel it became an acceptable practice. junior soldiers were free to argue with high-ranking officers because it promoted creativity and deflected group thinking. To this day, these reforms remain unique to the State of Israel, and they are nearly impossible to replicate because no other nation lives on the edge of destruction. In the ensuing years, the indigenous Israeli arms industry would prove its ingenuity based on the strategic and tactical circumstances. For example, in 1969, Israel lacked intelligence on Egypt's military deployments in the Suez. So, Israeli researchers developed a toy plane for long flight hours with a camera attached. It was the first military-use spy drone, and it provided invaluable intelligence on the Egyptian trenches built along the Suez Canal. The success of that toy plane laid the bedrock of the high-end Israeli aerial drones that we know today, and the succeeding aerial drones would play a decisive role in the conflicts with Syria. Meanwhile, at roughly the same time, Israel had been in talks with Britain to acquire a new type of main battle tank. The deal was close to signing, but the British backed away at the last moment. As such, Israel tapped into its human resources of its veterans and designed an indigenous tank of its own. The Merkava, as it became known, rolled out within a few years and quickly became the hallmark of the Israeli defense industry. Another breakthrough happened in the mid-1970s when the Americans provided the Israelis with new methods of satellite surveillance, but the system was not good enough. Lacking in strategic depth, Israel needed real-time satellite imagery, so it kicked off its own satellite program, and in 1988 the Ofek-1 satellite was launched into orbit. And just like that, Israel became one of the few nations with independent satellite launching capabilities, quite an achievement for a small nation. However, the underlying factor that accelerated Israel's technological advances was American support. Since 1976, Israel has been the largest annual recipient of US foreign assistance, and in 2001, that aid totaled a staggering $81 billion. If one were to adjust that amount to the annual defense spending of Israel, it would mean that nearly a quarter of Israel's military budget was and is effectively funded by the United States. This aid was crucial for the nurturing of the Israeli arms industry. Israel's reconnaissance satellites would play an instrumental role during the Gulf War in the 1990s. As Iraq fired salvos of Scud missiles into Israel, it shook the military-political establishment. Israeli satellites could track hostile missile launchers, but as missiles and rockets became cheaper, smaller, and more readily available, the danger came not just from hostile states, but also from non-state actors such as Hezbollah and Hamas. At the backdrop of the Gulf War, hostile non-state actors were firing dozens of rockets into Israeli settlements on a daily basis. A new type of air defense was needed to eliminate the threat altogether. So the Israelis pushed for a new defense system, and within a few years, they delivered 3 new weapons: the Iron Dome, the Arrow, and David's Sling. Each served a different tactical purpose, but together they neutralized the danger coming from missiles and rockets, at least in quantifiable sum. The technological supremacy of Israeli satellites and missile defense systems quickly became a household name. Ironically, even France, Britain, and America, who once reluctantly exported arms to Israel, were now fervently importing Israeli systems. Warfare is ever-changing. Whenever a new threat emerges, a new weapon is developed. The latest and current threat to Israel comes in the form of nuclear weapons by Iran. Now, to acquire nuclear weapons, the Iranians have to enrich uranium, which is done by centrifuges. Starting from 2009, Iranian centrifuges started malfunctioning one after another. The culprit was a malicious computer worm called Stuxnet, a new type of cyber weapon built jointly by the United States and Israel. Stuxnet essentially hijacked the Iranian centrifuges, allowing the controller to adjust the speed of the centrifuge motors to breaking point. Without firing a single shot, Israel's new weapon managed to derail Iran's nuclear program. Cyberspace has now become the latest branch in modern warfare, and since the Stuxnet attack, Israel has emerged as a leader in cybersecurity. But the leapfrog in technology that Israel continues to hold has also produced a number of constructive side effects. For one, cutting-edge military technologies have also transformed Israel into a nation of startups. It takes time for military advances to transmit into civilian applications, but in Israel, that process is faster because of the lack of bureaucracy we mentioned earlier. Another side effect is called arms diplomacy. Nations that seek to acquire high-end weaponry from Israel need to upgrade their diplomatic and economic ties as a precondition to gaining access to those weapons. This arms diplomacy has allowed Israel to set up strategic relationships in the most unlikely places, which in turn has strengthened its geopolitical hand. Now, if you want to learn more about the history of the Israeli arms industry, I highly recommend The Weapon Wizards by Yaakov Katz and Amir Bohbot. The authors enjoy unparalleled access to Israel's military-industrial complex, and their book has highlights from scientists, entrepreneurs, and lawmakers inside and outside of Israel. Altogether, Israel's military reforms and programs of the 1970s and 1980s progressively turned the country into one of the largest arms exporters in the world. Its multi-billion-dollar industry is the result of geopolitical necessity. When you live on the edge of extinction, you need to be able to adapt faster than anyone else. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. If you enjoy our content, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and Sol.